Good evening. Welcome to Today. Today we are receiving the Deputy Director at Consular Department of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Mongolia, Mr. Muhtushik, and Consular Chief of the United States Embassy in Mongolia, Mr. Jason Paul Spelberg, to talk about recently approved H-2A and H-2B visa to the United States for Mongolian citizens. Good evening, gentlemen.
Good evening.
Thank you for receiving our invitation. So my first question is from Mr. Muhtushik. This is the first time Mongolia is listed in H2 visa list. And how was it initiated? How did it start? Was it initiated from Mongolian side? Tell us about it.
We are firstly very pleased with the decision that Mongolia has been listed on the H2 visa category by the US side. And this idea came to us. It came from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs back in 2016.
2 years ago.
And at the end of 2016, in December, we proposed to the US side for the inclusion of Mongolia on the list of H2 visa eligible country list. So we are very glad that today we received the news from the US that Mongolia was listed. And it has been the result of the closer cooperation between my ministry and the US Embassy in Mongolia. That we've been exchanging a lot of information, and we've been exchanging the necessary information for the inclusion of Mongolia in the list. So we're very happy about the decision.
So it's interesting to me, how long does it take usually for other countries to get into the list?
How long does it take once the request goes in?
2 years.
Well, the request was formally put in May 2017. So the discussion started in 2016, but the actual request went in May 2017, the official formal request. So it took, 7 months before we got the result.
That was very fast. And Mr. Spilberg, can you tell us about the visa in general? And is there any limit to the number of people who can apply for the H-2A, H-2B visa within 1 year?
It's kind of complicated, but there's two different visa categories, H-2A and H-2B. H-2A are for temporary agricultural workers, and they are not numerically controlled. So their unlimited numbers can go to the United States. H-2B are for non-agricultural workers, and they are numerically controlled. Currently, 66,000 such visas can be issued around the world to all of the countries that qualify. The 66,000 number is doled up half, 33,000 for the first half of the year and 33,000 for the second half of the year. The US government fiscal year starts on October 1st and ends on September 30th. So we're actually almost halfway through the fiscal year already, and the first 33,000 numbers were already used in December. So there's no more numbers until March 1st currently. That's for H-2B again. H-2A is not numerically controlled.
H-2B, right. And it's seasonal employment opportunity. So what kind of sectors are included?
Well, it's not just seasonal, it's actually temporary. Seasonal can be a type of temporary employment, but so can intermittent type work or work that satisfies a peak demand for a service or product. So any kind of temporary work can qualify under the H-2 program. What kinds of work we typically see a lot of are workers in the tourism fields that go to work at resort towns that have a spike in demand during the summer or winter, maybe at a ski resort, amusement parks. There are certain restaurants in areas, in cities that receive a lot of tourists over a season. So seasonal tends to be very common. It tends to attract a lot of workers, but it's not restricted. The program is not restricted to seasonal work.
From Mr. Muhtushik, so will there be official platforms or the projects in order to provide information about these two visas to the public, to the Mongolian public from the ministry?
Well, before I answer your question, I must also emphasize that the decision that took only 7 months, like Mr. Spilberg said, but behind this decision there was a lot of hard work went between the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Mongolia and the US Embassy. So I must emphasize that point. As for the specific instructions for Mongolians who want to apply for these H-2 visas, One thing is to have Mongolia on the list. Another thing, most important thing, is how to find the right persons, right people who actually qualified for those H2 category of visas and jobs. So we're going to have to work very closely with U.S. Embassy about the specifics or the detailed procedure of how to apply for the visa. So this has not been decided finally yet, but we will decide on very shortly, since we have this decision only today. So.
Only a few days, right?
A few days, yeah.
And our audience might like to know about the procedure of these two visas in the United States. How is it managed? How is it monitored?
Okay, I can answer that. So the procedure for applying for an H2 visa starts with a labor certification. And this is not on the Mongolian side, this is on the US side. A US employer who sees a need for additional workers from outside the United States who can demonstrate that the US workforce is unable, there's not enough workers in the US to serve the demand that's required, can make a request to the US Department of Labor for foreign workers to fill that need. And that's called a labor certification. Once they get the labor certification approved by the U.S. Department of Labor, they send what's called a petition to the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. The petition is filed via the I-129 form, which can be found from the website www.uscis.gov. But the Mongolian visa applicant does not fill this petition out. It's the U.S. employer that does this. And the U.S. employer fills out the petition, sends it to the United States Office of Citizenship and Immigration Services, who then adjudicates it. If they approve it, then the beneficiary of the petition can apply for the H2 visa at the U.S. Embassy. So the procedure starts in the United States, and it's very important to emphasize this point. Any Mongolian who wants to work in the United States has to first find someone willing to employ him or her.
Them in the United States.
Yes, and the U.S. Embassy doesn't play a role in this process. All we do is adjudicate the visa when the applicant comes before us. We look to see if the applicant possesses the skills that he or she claims he has. We look to see if the applicant is going to be abused in the United States, and by abused, I generally mean underpaid. And we look to make sure that the applicant has a residence abroad that they don't intend to abandon. That's a requirement of the visa category. So they have to show that they're not going to move or immigrate to the United States permanently. If those three conditions are met and we have an approved petition, then we're going to issue the visa.
So from the public side, well, let's say someone is willing to apply for this visa. Where can they find these job announcements or the list of employers in the United States?
As far as I know, there's no single.
Advice,
there's no single web. There probably are some websites that are available for this kind of information, but I think it would start with a Google search. It might start with some. You probably have to have some English. It might start with some friends that you have in the United States looking for you. Unfortunately, we don't provide that. The U.S. Embassy doesn't get involved, and neither does the U.S. State Department or Department of Homeland Security. We don't get involved in trying to pair or match applicants with or prospective employees with an employer in the United States. It's really up to the individual to find a work opportunity.
I would also like to answer this question. So, although we haven't decided on the detailed procedure of how to find, how to connect those applicants and the employer in the States. So, what we can assure you from our side, from Mongolian side, is that we're going to make it very easy for Mongolians to find those employers who, as long as they have employers who are willing to have Mongolian workers coming to the States. So we're going to work with our embassy in Washington D.C. And after we decide on a certain procedure, then we will of course notify the public, so that we make it easier for them to find the right employer. Otherwise, going through all those websites and finding on the Google is a bit of a burden for Mongolian general publics.
Right. So there will be. You are assuring that there will be projects and platforms from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
Because we worked really hard for the inclusion of Mongolia on the list. So there's no point of us, doing nothing after the inclusion of Mongolia officially on the list. So,
so it must be asked. I think it's a tricky question: is the United States short of labor? Why are you approving this?
The answer to that question is probably yes. If labor certification is approved by the U.S. Department of Labor, then clearly for that particular sector, in that particular industry, in that particular location, that employer has demonstrated a lack, that they are unable to find local workers that can provide the service or product. So that's ultimately a decision that the U.S. Department of Labor makes domestically, and if they approve that certification, then the answer to that question is yes.
So about the locations and states, are there specific locations? Well, let's say for Mongolian citizens only this states and that states, this city. Is there anything like that?
No.
Regulations? No.
There's no regulation that restricts any national as to where they can work in the U.S. The regulations do say that when you enter the United States on a petition to work for this X company, that you're expected to work for X company, and not just abscond from that work and go find a job elsewhere. So the only restriction is that you are expected to work for the company that petitioned for you and that presented a labor certification on your behalf.
About the period of the stay, how long is it?
The period of stay is based on the labor certification. So the employer requests, an employer goes to the Department of Labor and says, I need X number of workers for X number of months to cover an intermittent demand in products or services that I can't provide with local labor force. So the visa is generally approved for that amount of time that's on the labor certification. Now, maximum to 1 year, up to 1 year.
Up to 1 year,
yes.
Right.
Now, once the individual goes to the United States and starts work, that petition can then be, or that status can then be extended each year up to 3 years total. Yes.
So it's possible to extend once you get there.
Correct. It is.
Well, I know many people who get visa, but they want to bring their family with them, children or spouse.
That is possible under the H-2 program. A spouse or minor child under the age of 21 who's not married can go on an H-4 visa. However, H-4 recipients are not allowed to work in the United States. So that's one thing to keep in mind.
Let's say someone goes to United States on the H-2A, H-2B visa, and they stay after the expiration of visa.
On the personal level, there's always the chance that one can be deported from the United States, which is a permanent record on their ability to ever go back. But on a more important level, doing that can possibly cause Mongolia not to be included next year on this list. This list is reviewed each year.
Each year.
Mongolia's inclusion will last until January 17th, 2019, at which time DHS will look at all the countries in the world again. And if a lot of people go and abuse the H-2 visa, the chances that Mongolia will stay on the list are low. They did drop 3 countries from the list for just this kind of thing this year. So that's the main thing. The main thing that we want to get across is responsible travel is about not just yourself, but about your colleague, about your compatriots, about your countrymen. To do that, to go to the United States and abuse an H-2 visa would be to harm other Mongolians.
Well, like he said, we worked really hard for the inclusion of Mongolia. But if someone who went to on H-2 visa to the States and overstayed his or her visa, next year, I'm afraid Mongolia will be, expelled from the list. So all this hard work will be gone. So what we would like the general public to understand is that this is, first, this is a temporary working visa. And secondly, if you overstay a visa, you ruin not only your, chance, it will also badly influence the Mongolia's image in the States. So one of the conditions I have to also emphasize that inclusion of Mongolia on the list is that for those overstayers in the States, Mongolian embassy in the United States of America has to work with the Department of Homeland Security in order for them to return to Mongolia. So this is also one of the most important goals of the government of Mongolia, which is to ease visa requirements of foreign states, to negotiate number of visa-free travel countries. So this has been always on the high on the agenda of Mongolian government and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So this H-2 visa is only one step
So there's a bigger picture.
Bigger picture.
People have to understand that.
In the future, we hope Mongolians will travel to United States visa-free. That's the bigger picture. That's the main goal that we aim to.
So let's not ruin it.
Let's not ruin it.
Depending on what index and qualifications, the list is made.
Tushik, he said it perfectly. The main criteria for inclusion on this list is the extent to which the foreign government collaborates with the Department of Homeland Security on helping us to deport deportable aliens. So that means if we find a Mongolian in the United States who violated his or her status, we expect that the government of Mongolia will help us document that person so that that person can be repatriated to Mongolia. Mongolia has been very complicit in this. They've been very collaborative, which is the main reason why Mongolia got included on the list. Secondarily, countries can be excluded from the list or included on the list as per the US national interest. And 3 countries were excluded from the list this year because of US national interest being that we want to see people travel responsibly, and the nationals from those 3 countries were not traveling responsibly, which is why it's so important that Mongolians do travel responsibly. Once you're included on this list, it would be a huge travesty to have that to have Mongolia be excluded next year or expelled from the list next year. It would be highly unfortunate for that to happen. So that's why travel responsibly is so important. The secondary criteria is that the nationals of the country included travel responsibly.
I would like to also stress 2 points. One is, of course, related to what he mentioned, to travel responsibly. Another thing is for those overstayers, for let's say there are 100 overstayers, or Mongolian visa overstayers in the States. Just because those 100 people overstay their visas, those in Mongolia, who wants to travel to United States to work, to visit, to enjoy,
to experience.
They're closing the way for them to, they're denying their chance to visit United States just because of those, let's say, 100 people. So, bigger picture demands us that we have to, urge Mongolians to be responsible when they travel abroad.
And that's all for today. Thank you for being with us. You're watching Today interview. We will see you on next Tuesday with more news and stories. Have a good one. Bye-bye.